Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. Welcome to Conversing. Today we have an opportunity to take stock again of the significance of where our nation is, not least as we come to the 250th celebration, which is just going to be a few days from the time that I'm recording this. At a time when so many people, pundits and writers, historians, average citizens, are all trying to take stock of where we are as a nation, it seemed as though it might be quite interesting to listen again to the episode that I recorded with David Brooks just after the 2024 election. It was before, therefore, the beginning of Trump's second term and all the events that have unfolded since that time. For many in our nation, this has been a period of great joy and celebration because of what President Trump has been doing. And for many others, in fact, well more than the majority of the United States, it's been a period of turmoil and anguish and worse. The chance to listen back on David's conversation with me that November gives us an opportunity now to think again about where we are and where we want to go, both in anticipation of the midterms and in anticipation of the 2028 elections. Those of you who are regular listeners to Conversing realize that we discuss many, many topics, of which politics is one. But whether you come to the 250th celebrating our national life in these 250 years or questioning our national life, whether you're in support of what's happening currently in America or whether you're overwhelmed by so much that you wish was different, may we give thanks to God for the place that we get to live, even as it's a place that is struggling to reach its ideals. Thank God for the gifts that God's given many, many of us because of the United States, and may we continue to pray and seek its welfare, its justice, its purpose, its fairness, and its equity. Listen now to David Brooks. Welcome to Conversing. Many of you as listeners will know that last week we had the opportunity to think on Election Day together with David Goatley, the president of Fuller Theological Seminary, and with Pete Weiner, a New York Times and Atlantic columnist, about the election. We were not trying to guess its outcome. We were just trying to think about the meaning of the moment and the significance of the decisions that the nation was facing. 1 week later, we have the opportunity to think again about what just happened, hence the title of this particular episode, What Just Happened in America. It's trying to draw us into reflection about what for many people was a bewildering election. Whatever our political position and regardless of who we voted for, there was so much that occurred in this election to try to unpack, to understand, to consider. And today we have an unusually capable guide to help us in the process of our reflections in understanding what just happened in America by having David Brooks as our guest. Many of you will know, of course, that David is the New York Times opinion columnist, a contributing writer to The Atlantic, a commentator on the PBS NewsHour, and he tends to write mostly about political, social, and cultural trends, just exactly like the moment that we're in right now, and the things that have preceded it, the things that it means for today, and the things that it might mean for tomorrow. His concern is always where there's a clash of ideas. How do we sort that out, and how do we come to our own mind about what we think is happening? And the always tricky subject of moral formation, which for David is a major concern. David, thank you so much for joining us today on Conversing.
Oh, pleasure to be with you.
You know, we are now on, as it were, the other side of the 2024 presidential election and national elections, regional and state elections. And I'm just wondering, give us a temperature read on how you personally are experiencing this moment about almost exactly a week since the election took place.
Yeah, I was up till 4 a.m. On election night. A little surprised, but not totally surprised. I guess I look at it in three levels, which we can get into. The first is the superficial level. You could say this was an election in which the Democrats lost because inflation was super high, and all around the world, electorates seemed to disapprove of inflation in a strong way.
Right.
So that's the most superficial level. But that doesn't explain why it wasn't Kamala Harris running against John Thune or some normal Republican.
Right.
So the second level is why is it a populist surge all around the country,
right,
or all around the world, frankly? And to me, that's the fact that Kamala Harris did well amongst highly educated folks and Donald Trump did extremely well amongst less educated folks. Mm-hmm. And so that's the class divide that really is driving our politics. And then the most profound level is we've become societies, not only in the U.S., but around the world, of increasing sadness and meanness. And this is the rising mental health crisis, the rising sense of distrust. And so I think you can't diagnose American politics or global politics without having to do with the mental health crisis, low trust, high loneliness, high anxiety, high alienation. And so it's, to me, that the root of our politics right now is not only inflation, it's not only a class divide, but it's some sort of spiritual and emotional crisis that people are trying to resolve.
So much of what you've written, whether it's your most recent book, How to Know a Person, or articles that I've seen both in the New York Times and in The Atlantic as examples, you dwell on all three really of those levels and point out a number of things that are so critical to this time and require different timelines to address as well, don't they? I mean, they really are such different, they're intertwined, but they don't have the same life cycle and the same capacity for change or evolution. It will unfold related to each other, but also in different lengths of time. Do you have any observations about that? I'm just curious.
I hadn't thought about it that term, but I think you're absolutely right. Like if inflation were the core issue, inflation is solved. Like we're down to about 2% inflation. Grocery store inflation, I look at my gas station when I drive by it, and it's in the East Coast, at least, not probably in California, but in the East Coast, it's $2.99 a gallon. And so the inflation it was a problem that was COVID. It was a problem caused by the overstimulating of the economy under Joe Biden, but that's pretty much solved. So that's not an existential anxiety.
Right.
The class divide is more of a generational thing. And that's caused over the last 20 years, high school educated voters just feeling alienated from Democrats, and Democrats feeling ever more insular, congregated in a few cities like Austin, Denver, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Washington.
Yes.
So I would say that's generational. The psychological and emotional, the rise of the period of loneliness, the period of alienation, the period of distrust, that's a multi-decade process.
Right.
And that, you could say, if we're on this podcast, it's a little having to do with the loss of faith, the loss of a sense of meaning, the loss of sense of belonging, the death of God, if you want to put it in Nietzschean terms,
right,
that people are looking for purpose and not finding purpose. And so that's almost decades or even century-long process. So I think you're right to identify the three different time frames.
Yeah. And it seems like that's part of what then is going to create so many interconnected challenges in bringing us to hopefully one day a healthier and better place, because the gnawing rate of these various factors is going to occur in different ways and with different bites being taken out of us as a society and a culture and as individuals. I thought it was really interesting in the article that you wrote about being an exiled Republican, that's a posture which I think is worth exploring at this point, because it feels like your own angle of vision about these things is affected by that evolutionary change. So I wonder if you could just distill for a moment what your argument in that article is, and then I want to ask you a few questions about it.
Yeah, like a lot of people, I'm politically homeless. So I'm a Whig. And so a Whig is someone who's sort of conservative on some levels, and one of my heroes is Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke's core philosophy is built around the concept of epistemological modesty, that the world is really complicated, and that if you think you're going to revolutionize society all at once, you're probably revolutionizing something that's too complicated for you to understand, and you're going to produce all sorts of complicated and unintended consequences. You're going to make everything worse.
Yes.
You should operate on your father, Burke wrote, you should operate in society the way you would operate on your father, with
Yes.
great tenderness and care and caution. And so that makes me a little believing, as Burke did, that change should be not revolutionary, but should be incremental but constant. And so that makes me a little less revolutionary, frankly, than either the Trumpian Republicans or the progressives.
Yes.
But my other hero is Alexander Hamilton, who's a Puerto Rican hip hop star from New York City. But Alexander Hamilton, there's one tradition in America which believes in liberalism, progressivism, which is using government to enhance equality, a very valid way to think about your political value system. There's another system which is more libertarian, which believes in limited government to enhance freedom, a very valid way to think about your politics. The one I subscribe to is the Hamiltonian system, which is limited but energetic government to enhance social mobility. So Hamilton's core idea was that we should create a government that helped poor boys and girls like him rise and succeed to become capitalists. And that tradition was carried on by, I would say, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay and the Whig Party in the early 19th century. Abraham Lincoln was a Whig, and during the Civil War used the Land-Grant College Act, the railroad legislation, the unified currency, all these things to create the sort of society for people like him,
Yes.
poor boys who want to rise and succeed. And to me, that tradition, which goes up to Teddy Roosevelt and maybe John McCain in 2000, that tradition is the unrepresented tradition in American politics right now. And I'm one of them. So maybe there are 6 Whigs of us, but we're here.
Right.
And so I felt myself a little politically homeless. And I have frankly waffled back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. More recently, I've waffled more on the Democratic side. And Isaiah Berlin, another of my heroes, a philosopher from the UK in the 20th century, said he was happy to be at the rightward edge of the leftward tendency. And I'm happy to be there. But it doesn't make it always for an easy comfort with the Democratic Party, which I guess is my party right now.
Right. One of the things that I found really interesting in that article was a comment that you make toward the end when you've done a wonderful job, as you always do, with laying out the challenges and the issues within Republicanism and the way that it's changed under the MAGA days and the way that Democratic Party politics at the moment is attractive to you and has certain strengths, albeit with lots of caveats about its own weaknesses as well. But one of the strengths that you attribute more to Democratic Party at the moment than to Republicans at the moment is the capacity for self-critique. And I thought that was a particularly interesting critique. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because I want to come back to it about the larger demographic shift that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of problems with the Democratic Party. I mean, one of the problems, for example, is the tendency on the progressive side of the sphere to categorize people and to assume that we're all members of certain identity groups. And so if you were a Democrat walking into this election, you probably assumed that if there was a woman who was at the top of your ticket, you'd get more votes from women because of that identity category would propel people to you. That turned out to be false. The gender gap in 2024 was lower than the gender gap in 2020. Joe Biden did better among women than Kamala Harris did. And if you came from the identity politics mindset, you would think there's such a thing as intersectionality, that people who are in oppressed groups will ally together, that Hispanics and blacks and women will all be part of the same alliance against the oppressor group. That is not what happened at all. I learned today a fact that surprised even me, which was 65% of Native Americans are Republicans, or Trumpian Republicans. And that does not fit into all the categories of the sense. And so to me, the identity politics paradigm has been very misleading to Democrats. It's caused them to make all sorts of false assumptions about how voters would break. And they haven't broken that way. But on the other hand, one of the things I found very admirable about the people in the Democratic universe is there are a whole series of thinkers who I find who are very independent thinkers, who are evidence-based thinkers, who are Democrats but very critical of the Democratic Party. And some of those are just the people I follow on Substack. There's a guy named Noah Smith, who's an economics writer, who's a Democrat but very honest. There's a guy named Matt Iglesias, who's a Democrat, very honest. But mostly I would say in my world, among those on the Democratic side, there have been two sorts of reactions to the election. I'd say the vast majority have been humbled, have been introspective, and have been, how do we get so out of touch? And then there's a smaller minority on the Democratic side who have said, well, Kamala Harris lost because the American people are racist and sexist. And I would just say, whatever you think of that, if you want to win future elections, probably calling the American elected racist and sexist is probably not the best way to go do it. And I would say, just on substantive ground, it's not accurate. It's not
Right.
what was driving people to poll. My view of Donald Trump is he's the wrong answer to the right questions. And a lot of people voted for Donald Trump for the very legitimate reason that they live in communities that have been left behind. And they may be doing well, or they may not be doing well, but they love their community. And if all the smart people for 40 years have been moving to Austin, Texas, and leaving their community behind, they understand that their community is struggling and they love it. And they want to pick somebody who will sort of be on that side to help them defend the community they love.
Right, right. You know, one of the things that struck me about that is that in Mark Knoll, the American church historian and American historian, has written a book about America's book, the Bible, in which he focuses on the use of the Bible in the 19th century. And when I was once interviewing him about that book, he said that there were two overarching problems with the use of the Bible. One was that people who were using the Bible in the 19th century to justify slavery or to reject slavery were guilty of two things. One was that they were not self-aware, self-conscious, and the second was that they were not self-critical. And when I think of those two categories, it does feel, mixed with what you're just saying, that the role of self-criticism right now on really, I would say, both sides is needed. And yet it is not an easy thing. Why is it, do you think, that in your observation, there's a bit more capacity for self-critique on the Democratic side currently than on the Republican side, without lifting up either as the ideal?
Yeah, there's a friend we both have, Jonathan Rausch, who has this concept of the epistemic regime, that the people who decide what is true or not. And, you know, that the epistemic regime includes the media and includes the universities. It includes scientific research, peer review process. And believe me, I can go on for hours about my problems with the universities these days. But I do think there's a core of people who still believe in the rules of evidence, and that they do believe that if the evidence suggests X, you should not say Y. I don't think that sense of conscience exists in the mind of Donald Trump. I do think fundamentally he'll say whatever it's in his interest to say, and factuality, or if that's a word, is not part of his critiquing. Even in the, in the election night victory speech, he said, "Well, we've won a great victory." That would have been fine. But he had to say it's the greatest victory in the history of the world, which it probably isn't. There have been a lot of victories, but he has to go all P.T. Barnum Huckster on us.
Yes.
And so, to me, the Democrats still have some of those intellectual virtues.
Right.
And I've really come to appreciate intellectual virtue as a thing, like to be intellectual courage, to be able to take a risk and stand for something that is unpopular.
Right.
Intellectual firmness, the ability to cling to your position and defend it, but not too much, to know when your position is completely undefensible and to shift. These are intellectual virtues, intellectual humility, knowing that reality is constantly going to surprise you. Mm-hmm. So you have to be intellectually flexible.
Right.
And these are virtues like any other set of virtues. And I guess I find them ultimately more on the Democratic side these days than on the Republican side, which was not true, frankly. When I came up in the 1980s, the Republicans, I felt, were much more intellectually advanced, to be honest. Alan Bloom was writing, Irving Kristol was writing, James Q. Wilson was writing, Gertrude Himmelfarb was writing, Jeane Kirkpatrick was writing. And in those days, I felt the right was, frankly, more intellectually sophisticated, intellectually more interesting. But something interesting happened in the 1990s, which is that conservative publishers decided the way to sell conservative books is not to write good books. The way to sell conservative books is to write books that'll make liberals mad. And then once you get the liberals mad, then the conservatives will rally to buy those books. And that produced Ann Coulter. That produced books like one called Liberal Fascism by a writer I really admire. And so the whole idea of those books, and Tucker Carlson is part of this, and Donald Trump is part of this. Let's say something that'll trigger the liberals, and then our side will rally to us, and that's how we get ahead. And it's a marketing strategy. It's just not an intellectual strategy, to be honest. And so that's been part of the corruption that's happened on the Trumpian right.
David, one of the things that is striking to me is that you've written this book, How to Know a Person, and I'm wondering if you can give us insights at a time like this into how to know a nation, because I think for a lot of people, this is a moment where people on the left and the right, I think potentially much more on the left right now than on the right, there was really a sense that we did not know the nation, at least the nation as it was being represented in a variety of various news sources, as well as cultural assumptions and so forth. What is different between knowing a person and knowing a nation? Is one just a bigger version of the other, or is it really quite a substantially different exercise?
It takes a lot more travel miles to know a nation than to know a person.
Yes.
And so, in 2015, I wrote a dozen columns saying to my New York Times readers, don't worry, Donald Trump will never get the Republican nomination. Don't worry, that will never happen. And I was living in Washington. My social life was in New York City. I was teaching at Yale. So I was on the Acela pretty much all the time. And so how could I be out of touch with America?
Yes.
And so since 2015, I've tried to spend, I now sleep 200 nights a year in hotel rooms. And that has its downsides, believe me. But the upside is I'm not totally surprised by the country anymore.
Yes.
And so you just come into contact with a lot of Trump supporters, which I was not. And when you meet them, you really get where they're coming from most of the time. And the story I often tell is I met a guy in South Dakota, and he was a big Trump fan, and I asked him why. And he said, let me tell you about the best day of my life. It was 35 years ago, and he was telling me this at age 70, so this was when he was 35. And he was the foreman at a plant that made casings for refrigeration units that go into apartment buildings. And they laid him off because in the plant, they used new technology, which he was no longer qualified to run. And so he said, I was going to sneak out. I didn't want to make a fuss. I was just going to pack up my stuff and go. And so he goes to his office. He packs up his stuff in a little box, opens his office door, and the 3,600 people in the plant have formed a double line leading him from his office door through the plant, out the parking lot to his car door. And so he walks out this phalanx of a double line of people who are all cheering and applauding him the whole way.
Wow.
And they just wanted to pay tribute to him for being a good guy. And so he said, that was the best day of my life. And it was 35 years ago. And every job I've ever had since has been worse, more insecure, less well paid. He said, my mom-in-law, who must be in her 90s at this point, is really sick. We can't leave the house any day because we have to take care of her. And so he says to me, that guy Trump may be a jackass, but I need a change. And so you hear that story and you think, okay, I don't agree with you maybe, but I get where you're coming from.
Right.
And I've had dozens and dozens of those conversations. So I get where they're coming from.
Right.
And I happen to live in Washington, D.C. I have a college degree, so life smiles upon me. But if I didn't have a college degree and I was living in South Dakota with the same skills I have now, life would not be smiling upon me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I understand why it looks different for people in different life circumstances.
So in part, what you're saying to the average listener of this podcast is, what are we really paying attention to? How are we seeing? How are we listening? How are we coming to actually, as it were, know a person in order to understand that behind the social reality is this personal dimension of not feeling credited for their being, their values, their longings, their appetites, their desires, their skills. Is that a fair?
Yeah. First, we should know that we have stereotypes. So there's a thing I wrote about in my book called stacking.
Yes.
Where I learn one fact about you, I make a whole series of assumptions about who you must be. Yes. You're a Trump supporter, therefore you must dress in camo. You must have you must drink PBR, Pabst Blue Ribbon. You must probably have a pickup truck. I'm making all these stereotypes. Yeah. These are never true. Maybe sometimes they're true, but I met a woman who was a lesbian biker who was at a Trump rally who'd converted to Sufi Islam after surviving a plane crash. So what stereotype do you fit into? So that's the reality of life. People don't fit into those stereotypes. And just when you think you have somebody pigeonholed,
Right.
they surprise you.
Right.
So that's
right.
the element of knowing a person. But then the second element is knowing how to show respect for a person.
Yes.
And I would say there's been a vast redistribution of respect in our society. And so it used to be if you were an HVAC guy and you were really good at your job, you could figure out what was going wrong with HVAC systems. There's a woman named Michelle Lamont who wrote about the aristocracy of the working class, like people who were working class, but they worked at intellectually very demanding jobs, and they were serving as breadwinners for their families, and they were the sort of people who kept the country going.
Right.
And you even think about like a bus driver. Think about how many decisions a bus driver has to make every hour, like when to pull over, who's a danger, who's in the back of the bus who's a problem. Like these are cognitively demanding things. And yet the flow of status and respect in this country has gone to people with elite credentials. And at my newspaper, at any newspaper, a national newspaper, 52% of the employees of these places went to the same 26 colleges. And so we've just redistributed respect away from large swaths of America,
Right.
and to people who have certain credentials. And that's bound to breed a reaction. And I think the most destructive thing we've done in the media, in nonprofits and the universities, is, as far as I know, in any mainstream media publication, there are probably no or almost no Trump supporters.
Yes.
At any elite university, there's no or almost no Trump supporters. At any nonprofit foundation, no or almost no Trump supporters. So if you tell 51% of the country your voices don't matter, well, people are going to get upset.
Right.
And they're legitimately upset.
Right. Right. Yeah. One of the things that I've been thinking about recently, since the election result in particular, but before that as well, is that there's this parallelism in my mind between what you experience about republicanism changing underneath you and evangelicalism changing itself underneath me or us. And in similar ways, there's a feeling that, as you describe it in one place, that there's a high level of spiritual and moral authority that's thought to be better among MAGA Christian supporters, but a lower intellectual confidence. And in the same way, it feels to me like the MAGA Christian population has been especially guilty of those two things. And what has occurred has been a vacating of a connection between what I would call the deep moral teaching of the New Testament and the example of Jesus, and the way that this turns into social responsibility and engagement in the culture. I'm just curious if you would comment on that.
Yeah, I guess I would say people are unitary wholes. And so I became a Christian, as you know, around 2013. And at that time, I was a newbie, and I thought I knew what Christianity was. And I thought Christians were people who read Henry Nouwen and Tim Keller and C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien and Sheldon Van Auken, The Sphere of Mercy. Like, that was Christianity. And I said to a friend of mine, who happens to be the person on the other side of this conversation, I didn't know what Christianity was. And you said to me, oh, you thought it was all the Shire. You thought we were just the hobbits. But American Christianity is a much broader coalition of people.
Yes.
And so to me, the people who read Tim Keller and Henry Nouwen and C.S. Lewis, that's what drew me to Christianity. And it has some problems. I'm a more Jewy Christian than I used to be, actually. I am more like Jesus was a badass revolutionary type than an Oxford Don. I believe
Yes.
that now more than I used to.
Yes.
But at least there was a level of real humility and intellectual rigor.
Right.
Say what you will about C.S. Lewis or J.R. Tolkien, they were scholars of the first rank.
Right.
And I think what's happened is that a lot of mainstream parts of evangelical Christianity have gone through the same things the Republican Party, as you say, is with Donald Trump. So 9 days before the election, my wife Ann and I went to a church in Tennessee, and it was a Christian nationalist church. I think it was called Global Vision Church, a non-denominational. And what struck us first was the way the pastor talked. And it was very Trumpian. It was very narcissistic. And he had been accused of embezzlement, I gather. And he made a 45-minute defense of himself. And it was so hyper defensive, I assumed he was guilty, frankly. But more than that, it was what it's like to be trapped in the claustrophobic mind of a narcissist, where he couldn't get outside of himself. It was just like me, 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 me. And that's a little like what it's like to be in a Trump rally. But then the second part of the sermon, which was another hour and a half, was about aggression. And so it was about they're out to get us. The Judases are out to get us. The betrayal is here. We have to fight.
Yes.
And that, I've been in services like this before. It's a joyless way to see the faith.
Yes.
And I didn't see a lot of smiling around the church. So I did see real expressions of faith. I don't want to minimize that. There really was expressions of faith. But it's a style of faith that mirrors the style of populist aggression, the feeling of being aggrieved, a feeling of being under assault,
right,
a feeling of zero-sum mentality. It's us against them. And it's, to my mind, it's not that Christ-like, frankly. But I don't live in their circumstances. And you're not going to, if you feel aggrieved and under assault and besieged 6 days a week, on Sunday, you're not going to magisterially feel generous and grace-filled on the seventh day of the week.
Right.
And so, I what I saw in that church was what I see in Trump rallies, but without the dissident flavor that Christianity is supposed to embrace, that we are in the world but not of it, and sort of the countercultural thrust of Christianity. I did not see. I saw it was just all of the same culture.
Yes. So, David, if you were king of the forest, as it were, and could somehow cause the church in America to step into this moment as you would think it's most needful to do, what would be needed and how would you hope it might come about?
Yeah. So I was a 50-year-old atheist coming into this experience and perfectly content, by the way. And so it wasn't like I was searching. It was just that it seemed to me against my will. We seem to live in a world that my material categories did not explore. And as my friend Chris Wyman writes in his beautiful book, My Bright Abyss, my materialistic categories did not explain the world as I experienced it. And so if I could, they made me Pope of the evangelicals, which is a job that makes me shudder. The first thing I would say is be not afraid. Like, I entered this world filled with spiritual hunger. And I found at the Christian colleges I visited, at the churches I visited, at Fuller Seminary, this world had everything the rest of the world is hungering for: a moral language, a spiritual vision, a sense that what matters in life is not how good your SATs are, but the reformation of the heart.
Yes.
And so to me, that if I were made in charge of the evangelicals, I hope I would embrace it with an abundance mentality and with the core knowledge.
Yes.
And if you remember when Pope Francis first came on the scene, all sorts of people suddenly fell for that guy.
Yes, yes.
And it wasn't only Catholics, it was Christians, it was atheists, it was everybody.
Right.
And the world just loves a human being who's trying to act like Jesus.
Right.
And so that sense of strength, that sense of 2,000 years of Christian social teaching. I used to teach at Yale, and I would teach over the course of one term 14 books. And one of those books was Dorothy Day's book, The Long Loneliness. And at the end of the term, my final assignment was to the students was pick any of the 14 books we've read and apply it to a problem in your own life. And in that particular year, 19 of my 24 students who were not Christian, who were Jewish, atheists, whatever you find at Yale, they chose Dorothy Day's Long Loneliness. And they chose it in part because of her emotionality.
Yes.
But in part because of her spiritual longing.
Yes.
And part because of her example of radical self-giving.
Yes. Yes.
And so to me, that's the most appealing thing about the faith is Christians who are living in a way that, as Dorothy Day said, doesn't make sense unless God exists.
Right.
And so that sense, I would say, get rid of this sense of being aggrieved and besieged and your religious liberties under assault. You have the keys to the magic kingdom, and trust in those.
Yes.
And people will rally, because I know so many people who are progressive atheists, wokesters, and they're looking for a spiritual home. And I happen to think that we're in a period where faith is in retreat, but I think that's just a rhythm of history, and that faith will be back, as it always has been back. And that living into the radicalism of the faith is the way to exemplify what people want.
David, it's a beautiful ending to our conversation. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.